Hello, and welcome to Grand Final History. In this episode, we go back to 1946, the 50th season of the VFL. The war was over, even though life was not quite back to normal. When the Herald asked what 1946 meant to some ordinary Melburnians, responses included the pleasure of returning to civilian life, the joy of family members returning home from service, and enjoyment of swing music from Tommy Dorsey and Spike Jones. There were concerns too. Frustration at the many strikes, disappointment at ongoing rationing and food shortages, frustration with high house prices and high levels of taxes, both ongoing challenges, and fear about atomic weapons. 1946 saw the return of Australian troops from the Pacific. The priority had been the rehabilitation and return of prisoners of war, with nearly 15,000 arriving home between September and October of 1945. In the early months of 1946, troops serving in Borneo, New Guinea and beyond were able to come home. It was a mammoth task of logistics, resources and prioritisation, with 224,000 Australians serving in the Pacific and 20,000, mainly airmen, serving in the United Kingdom and Europe. There was also the challenge of workers leaving war service industries like ammunition and aircraft factories, etc., back to the normal workforce. Women who had been encouraged into the workforce were now told to return home and let men take their jobs back. Not everybody was happy about that. While the hostilities were over, Australian forces were still serving in the aftermath, part of the occupation forces in Japan, and occupying territory in what would become Indonesia, Malaysia and more, while dealing with local forces that wanted independence and not a return of the colonialists, like the Dutch in Indonesia. People were not happy with the delays in getting the troops back home. Some soldiers on Pacific Islands held protest marches, and Prime Minister Chifley was the focus of an unusual protest when he landed in Bougainville at the end of December on a surprise Christmas and New Year trip. He was only meant to stay a few hours, but poor weather kept him there overnight. The next morning, his Dakota aeroplane had been obviously sabotaged. A tyre let down, spark plugs disconnected, and fuel tainted with some coloured substance. All easily seen before the plane would have taken off, but enough to cause further delay to the Prime Minister's departure. A not so subtle message from some servicemen who felt they too had been delayed long enough. The Prime Minister left that day, and most on Bougainville were home by March 1946. In June 1946, when most servicemen and women were back, Melbourne and the other state capitals stopped for special Victory Day celebrations, a much more formal occasion than the chaotic Victory in the Pacific Day in October 1945. Crowds flocked to the city to celebrate and thank the veterans, many of whom had put their uniforms back on for this special day. They marched through the city, some enjoying the free beers that were passed out from pubs. In September, a federal election saw the Labour Party and Prime Minister Ben Chifley return to power. Elsewhere in the world, January saw Ho Chi Minh elected president of North Vietnam. It might be a place that continues to make news in the coming years. In March, Winston Churchill, no longer the Prime Minister of the UK, made his famous Iron Curtain speech at an event in Fulton, Missouri, popularising the term and drawing attention to the division of Europe into Western and Eastern Soviet groups. That same month, the British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, agreed to India's right to independence. Britain was beginning to give up its empire. It would not be a simple process. Things were also changing in Japan. In May, the War Crimes Tribunal began its hearings, an opportunity to address some of the cruelty inflicted by the Japanese to prisoners and others. On a different note, a small company called Tokyo Telecommunications Engineering began, with just 20 employees. It would become better known as Sony, one of the many Japanese companies that would change electronics entertainment and other industries in the post-war world. The Nuremberg trials continued in Germany, and at the end of September, 22 senior Nazi leaders were found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to death or to prison. In consumer news, the first electric blanket went on sale in the United States. Many electric blankets would be given away to footballers and coaches on World of Sport and other TV sports shows in the future. The bikini was introduced to Paris fashion shows in 1946, and now some footballers sell them. The Christmas film, It's a Wonderful Life, starring Jimmy Stewart, premiered in New York and has been played every Christmas season ever since. Let's focus on the footy now. 1946 was both the VFL's 50th Jubilee and a year of football returning to communities and towns. While the VFL had played on during the war and the VFA returned in 1945, it was 1946 that saw the return of many suburban and country leagues to normal operations as people returned from services or war-related industries. One significant challenge was getting enough footy jumpers. Rationing was still in effect, and many local clubs realised players had not returned their jumpers before they left for service. Those jumpers were now scattered from Tobruk to New Guinea. One player declared he had seen a native of Borneo in the jungle wearing a footy jumper with the number 7. It would be an ongoing struggle for clubs to get enough tops for their players. VFL Secretary Like McBrien calculated the impact of Australian football in Victoria, declaring the game a gigantic industry, contributing £250,000 per annum, which is close to $20 million in today's money. The payment of players and umpires, along with the purchase of boots, balls, jumpers and equipment, and the membership entrance fees, with the occasional Savoy or packet of peanuts, did add up to a big number. However, it was still the era of players training just 2 nights a week, with pre-season beginning in March, payment of only £3 per game, and some players still playing as amateurs, with only newsprint and radio media coverage. It does not quite compare with the gigantic industry football has become in the modern era. I think Like McBrien would be impressed and pleased with how the game has grown, although he might be puzzled by the way the game is played. Just as now, a new season meant that there would be new rules. A 20th man was added to the bench, providing 2 substitute players, no interchange as yet. While the playing list was expanded, the 2 bench warmers would only get match payments if they went on the field. Previously, the 19th man got half pay unless he went onto the field. Some clubs were understandably reluctant to use the substitute players to avoid the additional cost, which must have been a frustrating way to spend an afternoon for those bench warmers. The other big change was the introduction of an official under-19 VFL competition. Only 7 clubs started in that first season: Carlton, Essendon, Hawthorn, Melbourne, North Melbourne, Richmond and St Kilda. The other clubs held out for a number of reasons, including cost and existing alignment with junior clubs, or in Collingwood's case, the schoolboy competition they had been using as a curtain raiser and source of recruits for some years. Another welcome return was the Brownlow medal, which would be back in 1946 for the first time since 1941. However, some returns had to wait. South Melbourne would share yet another season with St Kilda at the Junction Oval. The Lakeside Oval stands, plumbing and infrastructure had been left in a terrible mess by the Americans and needed repairs and rehabilitation before it would be ready for league football. It was an arrangement that was getting stressful. In January, it was revealed that the St Kilda Cricket Club had agreed to South using the ground for 1946, but the St Kilda Football Club had written to the league opposing the arrangement. St Kilda Football Club had noted that many of its members would not travel to away games, and had in fact taken out South Melbourne memberships so they could watch football at the Junction Oval week in, week out. Adding to the tension was a comment from the St Kilda Cricket Club that it would not object to the St Kilda Football Club transferring to some other ground. South would play the season at the Junction Oval, though it would be fair to say the welcome had worn out. Melbourne would return to the MCG, but only late in the season. Melbourne's dual Premiership captain, Noel McMahon, was a new player in 1946. He said on the first night of training back on the hallowed arena, the older players fell to their knees and kissed the ground. They would play most home games at Punt Road, as they had since 1942. Richmond were happy to host Melbourne once more, a warmer relationship than some other clubs. The new season also meant some new innovations regarding player payments and some serious arguments about league finances. Money has always been a topic of interest for the clubs and league administrators, and 1946 was no different. Players could look forward to greater financial rewards, though the benefits would take some time to flow through. With the end of the war and the end of donations to patriotic causes, the league had the confidence to establish a player provident fund. This would accumulate funds to be paid out to retiring players who had registered at least 5 seasons. Players would still get their £3 match payments, which would also now be topped up with £2 per week into the Provident Fund. The Provident Fund was established with cash the league already had, as well as proceeds from an extra round, taking the season to 19 weeks rather than the traditional 18 rounds, and from sales of the footy record. Players with 5 seasons experience would be eligible from 1946, but only games from this season would count towards payments. Players who had missed out on football due to war service would have an exception to the 5-year qualification rule. It was a welcome sharing of the increasing financial benefits of the game, but it was also a strategic incentive to keep players from shifting to the VFA without clearances. That would make them ineligible for any Provident Fund payments. It would make players think twice before accepting some big upfront payments from VFA clubs looking to repeat the recruiting coups of the late 1930s and early 1940s. While there was consensus on the Provident Fund initiative, there was division on the perennial question of pooling gate receipts. The vexed question of pooled receipts had been a key reason for the original breakaway from the VFA by 8 clubs 50 years ago in 1897. It had been finally implemented in 1945 as an emergency response to the wartime challenges. But now the war was over, several clubs were adamant it had to end. Richmond, Collingwood and Carlton declared they would not send their gate receipts to the league and challenged the league to sue them in the courts, which would be an interesting position given the VFL was an incorporated company with each club as an equal shareholder. After a few meetings, the pooling of receipts was dropped, and the clubs were once again responsible for raising their own revenue, with only the division of the finals gate takings coming from the league. The new rules, the Provident Fund, and the pooled revenue issue were all important, but they were not the only challenges to be addressed by the league. In March, Alf Brown reported on the push to ban the rapidly growing trend of autograph hunting by children who were harassing players as they entered and left the ground. There was talk of banning autograph books at grounds. I'm not sure that's how to promote fan engagement. The autograph hunters were not deterred. Before the season started, the league celebrated with a Jubilee dinner at the Doric Hall on Albert Road in South Melbourne. Over 100 officials, former champion players and members of the VFL were seated at tables representing the outer fence of a mini football oval with grass, goals, boundary line and a football ready to be bounced. Foundation Secretary Edwin Wilson, who had shepherded the league through its first 34 years, was at the dinner and surely would have been impressed with the organisation's growth as the premier football league in the country. While the Golden Jubilee dinner was a fine affair for the 100 attendees, held just after the end of the war, with rationing still in place, it would not compare to the centenary dinner bash 50 years later in April 1996, when over 3,000 guests were entertained as they sat in the MCG. I wonder if anyone from the 50th anniversary dinner made it to the 1996 event. Only 2 new coaches were appointed for the 1946 season, which is surprisingly low for this era. Geelong appointed Tommy Quinn, their 3rd coach in 3 seasons since returning to the VFL. Quinn had played from 1931 to 40, a member of the 1931 Premiership team, and pivotal in their 1937 Premiership season. He captained the club 7 times that season while Reg Hickey was injured, and was best on ground in that grand final win against Collingwood. Could he get the Cats closer to the top 4? St Kilda's Hugh Thomas' short 2-year senior coaching career was over. The former Collingwood Reserves coach had got 1 win against his nemesis, Jock McHale, but the Saints had not made enough progress, and a wooden spoon in 1945 meant it was time for yet another change. Former Essendon Premiership player Alan Hurd would take over as playing coach. Could he be the man to lift St Kilda? To celebrate the new era of peace, Footscray were brightening up their look with royal blue, red and white jumpers, replacing the drab, dark blue, red and white tops. Before we get into the season, I want to give a plug for another podcast, which is a terrific interview with a player we will mention in this and coming episodes. Jack Jones served in the 24th Infantry Battalion on Bougainville. He returned home to find an invitation to train with Essendon. It is a remarkable story and well worth hearing about a man who lived and played VFL footy through this era. Check out the Howie Games podcast, episode 6, Jack Jones. It's well worth a listen. The opening round was split over Easter Saturday and Easter Monday, 3 games each day. The league and clubs were delighted with a record 144,000 people who went to the 6 games. The small crowds of the wartime era were over. People wanted to be back at the footy. It was a cracking opening round. Footscray hosted Essendon, and despite being 22 points down at 3/4 time, they came home in a rush to win by 2 points. Bulldogs' Jim Tom became the first ever 20th man to take the field and made a name for himself, kicking the winning goal off the ground late in the game. Fitzroy hosted Richmond at the Brunswick Street Oval, and the 2 1944 grand final teams put on a show, with the Tigers winning by just 4 points. The 1945 Bloodbath grand final rematch was on at the Junction Oval. With many players suspended or retired, it was 2 new-look teams taking the field in front of 38,000 people, for Carlton to once again take the honours by 8 points, in a much calmer game than their previous encounter. This was Bob Pratt's last game for the Swans. His comeback, 7 years after leaving for the big money in the VFA and then serving in the war, had looked good in the pre-season games. In round 1, he started well, kicking 2 goals in the first quarter. He might have been a bit slower, and the leap was not quite as high, yet his skills and experience still made him a dangerous forward. We'll never know how the season could have unfolded. He injured his knee, and after seeing out the game with just those 2 goals, his career was over. In 1934, he had kicked a record 150 goals, and his career was once summarised by his wife, who said, "He led like Dunstall. He marked like Ablett. He kicked like Lockett. And best of all, he looked like Modra." He played 158 VFL games and kicked 681 goals at an average of 4.3 per game, and won 1 premiership with the Swans. If he had not gone off to the VFA, if the war had not intervened, who knows what he might have added to his illustrious career. Before we go on to the other games, I'll also call out another South Melbourne player, Bobby Mullinger. Bobby did not have the career or profile of the big stars like Bob Pratt, but his story is extraordinary and just one example of several players who made their way back to play at the highest level in their state after surviving the harrowing trials of the Japanese prisoner of war camps and the Burma Railway. Bobby had played 4 games for South in 1939 and 40 before enlisting, and made it back to play the first 2 games of 1946. It was a short, interrupted career, but I think an amazing triumph for Bobby and others like him that were able to reach the highest level of football in their home state after all they had been through during the war years. In the other games, Melbourne were too strong for a young Geelong team, Collingwood had a big win over Hawthorn, and North continued their improved form from 1945 with a big win over St Kilda. Making a return for St Kilda was the renowned RAAF pilot and Australian cricketer Keith Miller, who had just come off a long tour of service cricket matches in England, through India and around Australia, followed up with an Australian team touring New Zealand, playing the first test match between the two countries. Literally, the day he got off the plane back into Melbourne, he borrowed a pair of boots and joined St Kilda for a training run. The selectors put him into the opening game. Early in the first quarter, Miller felt a tap against his ankle as the ball approached. The second time it happened, it was an attempt to trip him. Miller looked at his opponent, Sid Dyer, and said, "Look, Sid, in the war, we were taught how to kill. Do you want me to revert?" Sid kept well clear of Miller for the rest of the game. Anzac Day fell on the Thursday after the opening split round. The football record was frustrated with the inconsistent methods of recognising this special day, pointing out that the Sydney Rugby League had scheduled competition matches while the Victorian players were not even allowed to train on Anzac Day. It's a policy that would take some time to change. Round 2 saw Carlton unfurl their Premiership flag at Princes Park, but an ugly incident during the game is a reminder that things were not always better in the past. The ball had been kicked through the Carlton goal, but the umpire had already awarded a free kick to a Melbourne player, so no goal was registered. This enraged one spectator, who jumped the fence and punched and then kicked the goal umpire. Police, 2 Carlton players and trainers rushed to the scene, only to be greeted with a shower of beer bottles that fortunately missed their mark. With more police arriving, the crowd eventually settled. Bad crowd behaviour has a long history. In round 5, it was another ugly scene at Princes Park, when North players were heckled as they left the ground after losing against the Blues. Something nastier than usual must have been said, and 2 North players jumped out of the race and began fighting with spectators. There were fears of a all-in brawl, but the police quickly settled things down. No action was taken against the players. The police were also being given the job of preventing footballs being stolen during games. Boys were being posted outside grounds to collect the balls that went over the fence. Bad enough at any time, but when access to leather and rubber for bladders was restricted, it was a challenge to supply good quality footballs for league games. One of the hardy perennials of football journalism is the interview with a star from an earlier era who bemoans the game is not as good as it used to be. In 1946, it was Rowley Watt, a member of the famed Essendon Mosquito Fleet, who won back-to-back premierships in 1923-24. Now, just over 20 years later, he declared the modern game was sacrificing science for speed. Kicking had deteriorated. Handball was too erratic. Ruckmen were clogging up the forward line, and the current holding the ball rule was not working. Modern supporters, watching the film footage of games from the 1940s, might be surprised that that style of play was seen as too fast. Whatever the era, there will always be those who claim the game was better in the past. The modern era of football would have looked very different if the advice of a football supporter had been followed in 1946. Signing off as nemesis, the author declared it was time for the league to take a stance on Hawthorn's delinquencies as a member of the great football organisation and remove them from the VFL. While the Hawks still had some tough times ahead, I think they have since justified their place in the competition. By the end of May, the first third of the season was complete. 6 rounds out of 19, and Footscray was on top of the ladder undefeated, closely followed by Essendon with 5 wins and an extraordinary percentage of 168%, thanks to a series of big wins with just that 2-point loss to the Bulldogs in round 1. The Sporting Globe declared the Bombers the form team at this point of the season. Richmond, Carlton and Collingwood followed, all on 4 wins. North was 6 with 3 wins. A good result against Richmond in round 2 had not been followed up, but there was still hope if they could regain that form. Melbourne was 7th, also on 3 wins. The Sporting Globe declared Melbourne must surely have disappointed themselves even more than they have their supporters. Fitzroy and South followed on just 2 wins, with Geelong, St Kilda and Hawthorn all at the familiar end of the ladder with 1 win each. South Melbourne had lost the first 4 games of the season, the first time that had ever happened to a previous season's grand finalist. Carlton and South could point to the loss of players from suspension after last year's violent grand final, so perhaps their performance would improve in the coming weeks as some of those players became eligible to return. South did have a better result in round 7, when veteran Jack Graham had his big moment. He was so close to the boundary line that coach Bull Adams told him that this would be the last kick of the day. The ultimate challenge. Win the game if you're good enough. The teams were tied, so any score would do. Despite the angle and the pressure, Jack calmly took his shot and scored the winning goal, the bell ringing out as the flags were waved, the childhood dream fulfilled, and a much-needed win for South. South hoped their prospects would improve with a new forward who had made very rapid progress from park football to the VFL. In 1940, Max Piggott had been a promising junior footballer, but wartime service took priority. Discharged from the Army in 1946, he played 1 game with South Districts, a suburban club long associated with South Melbourne. His form was so good, he played with South Melbourne reserves the following week. Seeing his potential, selectors immediately selected him at full forward for the all-important Lakeside Premiership match against St Kilda, the 7th player to be tried in that spot after the loss of Bob Pratt in round 1. From park football to the VFL in 3 games. As he took his position in front of the goals, clearly new to the culture of VFL football, he turned to the fullback and said, "G'day, Max Piggott," sticking out his hand to shake his opponent's hand. "I've just got back from the war. A bit out of fitness, and I've still got a touch of malaria. Can you take it a bit easy on me today?" His opponent looked him up and down, didn't shake his hand, and simply told him, "You can go and get..." I'll let you finish the sentence. That St Kilda fullback was none other than that famous RAAF pilot and one of Australia's finest all-rounders, the dashing Keith Miller. On debut, Max Piggott kicked 4 goals as South recorded a comfortable win. Spoiler alert, there was no fairy-tale long league career for Max. He ended up playing 4 games in 1946 and 4 more in 1947, kicking 21 goals before an elbow injury ended his career. It was a short career, but one of the fastest progressions through the lower grades to the VFL level, and 8 games of VFL football is more than most ever get to play. He must have been a character. After moving to Western Australia as a farmer, he decided that he could do a better job of writing about rural affairs than the incumbents, and talked his way into a job at the tender age of 54, and kept submitting articles until he was 90. So, congratulations to Max Piggott. Round 10 saw the upset of the season, when second-place Essendon, who had only lost 1 game all season, travelled to Kardinia Park and got completely outplayed by Geelong, who were second last on the ladder. The Cats would have celebrated their 6-goal win, while the Bombers caught the train home, wondering what just happened. They would have been on top of the ladder if they had won, because Footscray lost their game of the round against Carlton by 4 points. It was a tough week for the tipsters. Other than the Collingwood-South Melbourne game, 5 matches were won by the team lower on the ladder. There was a break between rounds 10 and 11 for the interstate game. Played at the MCG, Victoria had an exciting draw with South Australia. The Vics kicking the last goal of the day to finish 19 goals 9, 123 to South Australia, 18 goals 15, 123. Yet the Herald asked the obvious question: were Victorians interested in interstate games? In a season where weekly attendances was regularly over 100,000 across the 6 games, only 28,000 people went to the MCG to watch the best players from Victoria take on the top South Australians. Early July saw the implementation of a new stage of football telecommunications, although the cost was significant. The issue was an ongoing 4-month wrangle about the refusal of the Western Australian League to clear Ern Henfrey to Carlton. A three-way telephone hookup had been scheduled between the members of the Australian Football Council in Melbourne, Adelaide and Perth for a 30-minute discussion, which was going to cost a headline-grabbing £10. In today's money, that would be about $850. So maybe not surprising that this was a headline maker. It was all to no avail. The Western Australian League noted that Henfrey had requested his bank employer transfer him to Melbourne. He had paid his own way to Melbourne, and it was not a bona fide employment transfer, so he would not be cleared to play football for Carlton. Not sure who paid the £10 for the complicated phone hookup, though. Football lovers, and Melbourne supporters in particular, would have been thrilled to read the Herald on the 11th of July. There was a major article describing the return of the MCG, with a small squad of tradesmen working through the process of setting the ground up for the return of sport. The groundsmen were happy with the condition of the surface. A skeleton crew had been looking after the field throughout the occupancy by different military services since 1942, and head curator Bert Luttrell said the Yanks and the RAAF had treated the ground with respect and care. After round 12, the season was 2/3 complete, and the ladder was looking quite different to the round 6 milestone. Essendon, with 10 wins, had taken top spot from Footscray when they beat the Bulldogs by 28 points in that round 12 at Windy Hill. Footscray had been on top since round 5, but now dropped to second, also on 10 wins. 2 games ahead of Collingwood and Carlton, completing the 4. Melbourne had lost games earlier in the season, but were now just 1 match behind Carlton, and looking threatening. Richmond had dropped away, sitting 6th, 2 games out of the 4. Finals chances were looking slim. South were recovering after a slow start, but an agonising 1-point loss in the last moments of the game with Carlton at Princess Park left them 7th on the ladder, 2 games out of the finals, followed by North on percentage. 9th on the ladder was Fitzroy with 5 wins, then Hawthorn, Geelong and St Kilda, all on 2 wins. The Saints had hung a wooden spoon in their boardroom after finishing last in 1945, and if they did not change something in the final 7 games, they might need to add to that collection. Not surprising, both Essendon and Footscray had used the fewest number of players so far this season, 29 and 30 respectively. That stability reflecting both good form and fewer injury problems, while North, who had dropped away from their 1945 performance, sitting mid-ladder rather than in finals contention, had used the most players, with 43 taking the field. One of the Essendon players who was contributing to that stability was Jack Jones, who, in his debut season, had played every game except 2 missed through injury. The Sporting Globe noted that he was a star in his first season. Once you finish this episode, as I said earlier, if you want a first-hand account of life, war service and footy in this era, check out episode 6 of the Howie Games, recorded back in 2016. Jack's tale is remarkable. Round 14 took place the same day the Victorian team was in Adelaide, beating the South Australian side after a loss in 1945 and the drawn game at the MCG earlier in the season. One new face in the Victorian team was Geelong's first-year player, Fred Flanagan. It won't be the last we hear of this Geelong legend, who joins a rare list of players selected for the state team in their first season. A famous footy incident occurred in the round 15 game between Footscray and Richmond at the Western Oval. It was a must-win game for the Tigers in the hunt for the final spot, while the Bulldogs were looking to keep their top 2 position on the ladder. Richmond's chances looked gone at three-quarter time, 6 goals down, playing at the Bulldogs' home. However, a last quarter rush had them in the game. Jack Dyer, playing at full forward late in the quarter, outmanoeuvred fullback Albie Morrison to take a good mark and turned quickly to run into the goals. Imagine Jack's horror when he felt the ball going flat in his hands, the air rapidly escaping after a piece of glass had lodged itself in the leather. Jack knew 3 things in football. Speed is king. Move quickly when you have the ball, and do your thinking as you go. If he stopped to show the ball to the umpire a replacement would be made, but the play would restart with the ball up. However, a goal would get the Tigers within 1 point of Footscray. He kicked the deflated ball, which felt like a wet paper bag, when he was just 10 metres out from goal. The flat piece of leather flew off the side of his boot and went through for a behind. Over the years, the incident's reputation grew, and many a time Jack claimed the leather went through the goal and the bladder went through the behinds and the team scored 7 points. The truth was a let-off for the Bulldogs. There was still plenty of action in the final part of the game. Moments after Albie Morrison had kicked the new ball in from fullback, the Tigers' Mopsy Fraser had a snapper goal that levelled the scores. The last piece of drama was the Bulldogs' forward push from the centre bounce. Having barely got the ball past the centre line in the last quarter, the ball flew down to Bill Wood, who marked just before the bell rang to end the game. His kick, after the bell, from 35 metres out, went straight through the middle. The Bulldogs' only goal for the quarter, giving them a 6-point win. Jack Dyer contemplated what could have been, although it did become a great yarn in the years to come. Round 17 saw second-place Collingwood host third-place Footscray in the match of the day at Victoria Park. The Magpies won, but it was a critical game in terms of injuries. Des Fothergill had starred for the Magpies since his return in 1945. 62 goals in his first return season, and 63 goals up to round 17 in 1946, the most for a Collingwood player since Ron Todd's 121 in 1939. Fothergill injured his knee and missed the rest of the season. Bill Toomey copped a knee in the thigh, causing enough damage to keep him out until the finals. On a more positive note, the round 17 game saw the debut of a young Bobby Rose, the first of the Rose brothers to play for Collingwood. We'll hear more about him in future episodes. Round 17 also saw the first game played at the MCG since the 1941 Grand Final. Melbourne hosted Hawthorn in front of 15,000 people, who saw the Demons have an easy win and maintain their one-game gap over Richmond. Round 18 saw the Tigers host Carlton in front of 38,000 who squeezed into Punt Road. The Tigers kicked 7-9 in the final quarter to beat the Blues. Melbourne scraped home by just 4 points against 7th place Fitzroy. Richmond was still a game out of the 4. The 4 would be confirmed in the final round, but the Tigers needed to beat top-of-the-table Essendon at their home ground and hoped that 9th place North Melbourne could somehow topple Melbourne. Richmond did their best. At one stage they had kicked a remarkable 16 goals from 18 shots, but Essendon held on by just 1 point. It would not have mattered. Melbourne went on a romp in their second game on the MCG, beating North Melbourne by 37 points to secure 4th spot. The Demons had been 9th on the ladder after round 9, and then won 9 out of 10 games to make the 4. They had momentum. Essendon finished the home and away season on top, 2 games clear of Collingwood, who, without Toomey or Fothergill, lost against Carlton, leaving them with 13 wins. Footscray and Melbourne also had 13 wins to make up the 4. It was another year of turnover in the final 4. 1945 had seen 4 new finalists compared to the previous season, and in 1946 there were 3 new teams compared to the previous season, only Collingwood surviving from the 1945 final series. Richmond achieved its second Almostus award for just missing the finals in 5th spot, on 11 wins. Carlton, at 6, also had 11 wins, unable to defend its 1945 premiership. South was 7th, meaning both grand finalists missed out in the following year. Fitzroy, the 1944 premiership winner, was on 8th, 9 wins, also missing the finals for the second year after their premiership. The 4 teams who had played in the previous 2 grand finals were all out of the finals, which has got to be a unique event. North were 9th with 8 wins, which is good by their historical standards, but a disappointment after their finals appearance in 1945. Geelong were 10th, having won 4 games. St Kilda had avoided the wooden spoon by 1 spot, and Hawthorn were 12th, another wooden spoon, with just 3 wins. The first semi-final would be between Melbourne and Footscray, and the following week Essendon would take on Collingwood in the second semi-final for a spot in the grand final. Tension was already raised at the Western Oval when the Melbourne Cricket Club refused permission for Footscray to train on the MCG. The Bulldogs were willing to train on Monday and Wednesday night, but that was reserved for the Melbourne Seconds. Melbourne had always had something of a home ground advantage for finals, but perhaps even more so in 1946. They had played on the ground twice towards the end of the season, while Footscray had not seen the ground since 1941. Or would Melbourne argue that they had only played 2 games since 1941, so they did not have much more experience on the ground than anyone else? The Brownlow medal returned in 1946 after being suspended since 1942. The winner was Melbourne's ruckman, Dr. Don Cordner, who finished 1 vote ahead of Carlton's Jack Howell and Richmond's Bill Morris. The news reached Cordner via telephone about 9 p.m. in his Greensborough medical practice, where he worked with his father. After the phone call and a quick photo stop for the Sun photographer, he went off to see his next patient in Hurstbridge. There was no big public count or event in those days. He had to wait until March the following year to be summoned to Harrison House to be presented with the medal. Winning a Brownlow medal as a ruckman has become a rare event, but Don Cordner has a unique Brownlow medal record. He is the only player to win as an amateur. All the Cordner brothers played as amateurs. It's not something we see in the modern era, but brother Dennis Cordner gave some clue when he said, "It gives you a certain freedom of mind which enables you to keep the game in proper perspective." Don Cordner also explained that football had to fit in with his medical studies and his practice. He only trained about 3 times during the entire 1946 season, and being an amateur gave him the freedom to approach football in this way. It was clearly deeply ingrained. More than 50 years later, he was interviewed for a book on Brownlow medal winners, and he was adamant that the publication of the book would not impact his amateur status. He was 81 at the time. Before we get into the finals, I want to mention one player who had a literal life and death struggle during 1946. While the war may be over, its impact was still being felt. Alan Killigrew debuted for St Kilda in 1938, winning the best and fairest in 1940 before service in the Navy interrupted his career. He played 2 games in 1946 before being admitted into the Heidelberg Repat Hospital with tuberculosis of the spine, caused by a TB infection caught in New Guinea, moving from the lungs to the spine. He spent months in hospital, at times in a coma. The sporting community rallied to support him by raising funds at football matches, a boxing night, and even a celebrity football match between radio stations 3DB and 3KZ that attracted 10,000 spectators. Over £1,000 was raised across the year, about $86,000 in today's money. Killigrew would never play again, but as a coach of St Kilda, North Melbourne, Norwood in the Sandful, and various country and suburban teams, he would achieve fame, if not always success. He has been credited with laying the foundations that led to premierships at both St Kilda and North. That's all to come, but for all the faults of footy, it does have an extraordinary capability to reach out and support those in need. The first semi-final was on Saturday the 7th of September, a fine, sunny day with 61,000 people flocking back to the MCG for finals football. The Melbourne Cricket Club had to deal with a rush of members looking to renew their memberships before the final started, so they had up-to-date medallions to enter into their home ground. Caterers were taking advantage of the post-war MCG facilities with what the Herald described as an ingenious tie-up of 14 Army field telephones to ensure the smooth distribution of supplies. Those supplies included sweets sold by boys who'd been lining up for jobs since 7 a.m. Would Footscray win their first final, despite losing their last game against lowly Geelong? Or could Melbourne continue their fine run since the middle of the season? Melbourne were favoured by most of the previews and were warmly welcomed onto the ground by many in the crowd. Brownlow medal winner Don Cordner entered the ground on his own, a minute or so after his teammates, getting a special cheer with many of the Footscray players running over to congratulate the good doctor. Footscray had the wind in the first quarter and looked faster around the ground, but could not take advantage in their forward line. Melbourne then settled down and got their passing system going, building an 8-point lead at quarter time. The Bulldogs would have been in front if they'd kicked straighter. Melbourne 4-4 to Footscray's 2-8. A strong second quarter of the Demons with 8 goals to the Bulldogs 3 got them out to a 4-goal lead at half-time. Some positional changes by the Bulldogs rebalanced the team, and they began to play like a side that had been on top of the ladder for much of the season. A 6-goal quarter, including a 10-minute purple patch where they kicked 5 goals won, got them in front by 1 point at the final change. Norm Smith took a mark before the third quarter bell, but his long kick went so wide it missed everything. A quick-thinking policeman, serving on the boundary line, leapt in the air and took the high mark, receiving a great round of applause and something to brag about for the rest of the shift. It had been a terrific game, and the final quarter was something special. Mueller for Melbourne kicked the first goal to take the lead back early in the first term. It was tough football in the final quarter, with the ball moving fast. Players knew a loss was the end of the season. As the clock ticked into time on, Footscray led by 7 points. The Bulldogs' captain-coach, Arthur Oliver, took a strong pack mark only 30 yards from goal. He was Ted Whitten's childhood hero, but he was hurting and weary after 4 challenging quarters. He shot curved away from goal, and the ball was forced out of bounds to the sounds of groans from Footscray supporters. Melbourne's Fred Fanning was out of the forward line and into ruck duties. His tap to advantage was a beauty. The Demons raced the ball up the ground, and Norm Smith scored a goal. Yet again, the sides were split by only 1 point. The next few minutes broke Footscray supporters' hearts. From the bounce, the ball went to the Demons' Jim Mitchell, whose long shot was straight. Melbourne led now by 5 points, and time on was ticking away. After the bounce, the ball was back into the Melbourne forward line, and Len Dockett had a shot. It went wide, but the gap was 6 points. A goal would tie the game, and maybe both teams would be back the following week. From the kick-out, Footscray raced the ball into their forward line, only to be stopped by that man, Fred Fanning, helping out in defence, away from his normal home in the forward line. He took a strong mark and booted the ball forward. Ernie O'Rourke then kicked another goal for Melbourne to grab a 12-point lead, which surely was going to be enough. From the centre bounce, the ball once more raced forward, and Len Dockett's kick went straight this time. Another goal just as the bell was sounding. 4 goals won behind in the last 4 minutes of the game to turn a 7-point deficit into an 18-point win. It was exhilarating football, unless you were a Bulldog supporter. Mueller was critical for the Demons, one of the best on ground and the leading goal scorer with 4 for the day. So what would his reception be when he went back to his lodgings in the pub in Footscray, run by former Footscray committee member Con Curtin? Maybe Con might be tempted to change the locks. The second semi-final was on Saturday, September 14, with a record 77,000 watching, and they got a thrilling game. Essendon were the clear favourite. They had been the form team during the season, and the spot in the grand final was theirs for the taking. Collingwood had other plans, and they played better in the ruck division and were on top across the centre, and Lou Richards was having a day out. By halfway through the third term, they were clear in front, 10-13 to 7-7, a lead of 24 points. Some Collingwood supporters were already planning their grand final weekend. However, this Essendon team were too strong to hold down for the entire game. Don's rover Bill Hutchinson was playing a great game, and the Bomber defence started to tighten up, breaking the Collingwood rhythm and edging themselves back into the game. As they went into the fourth quarter, the gap was down to 16 points. Essendon started the last quarter brilliantly. 3 goals in 5 minutes had them back in the lead, and from then on the game was on a knife's edge. The lead changed 5 times and was level twice. The noise was incredible as the crowd urged their teams on. Deep into time on, Collingwood were 2 points up. Fons Kind had a shot at goal for the sealer, but it hit the post. The gap was now 3 points. The ball was rushed to the Bombers' forward line, and now it was Bill Hutchinson who kicked but missed. Another behind. The Magpies got the ball out to the wing, but Ray Hallwood slipped, and the elusive Dick Reynolds swooped, yet his shot went wide. Now the gap was just 1 point. The ball was kicked back in, and the play was scrambled. Essendon's Gordon Abbott kicked it out to Jack Casson, who could have won the game, but he also missed. 3 behinds to Essendon in the last 2 minutes tied the game. The kick-out went straight up the centre of the ground, but it was too late. The bell rang and the game was drawn. Players were exhausted and confused. Lou Richards looked at Dick Reynolds and said, "What do we do now?" Without a moment's hesitation, Reynolds said Essendon had won because they kicked the last score of the day. He then walked off. Lou wasn't sure if Reynolds was telling the truth or pulling his leg. It was not an Essendon win. The second drawn final in VFL history, following the 1928 semi-final between Melbourne and Collingwood, meant the teams would be back the following week to replay the second semi-final, while Melbourne had another week to rest, recover, and hopefully not go stale. Essendon were, again, clear favourites for the replay, and 65,000 people turned up to watch the game, the crowd down on the previous week due to the wet weather. Those at the game and listening at home might have been wondering if a second replay was going to be needed when both teams were still level at three-quarter time. Essendon had been spraying their shots, 6-13 to Collingwood's 7-7. There might have been a few nervous administrators and curators who were already worried that the MCG surface did not have enough time to be prepared for the first cricket game of the season, when the England touring team was due to play. It soon became clear that no further replays would be required. Essendon dominated the last quarter, kicking 4-1 and winning the game by 19 points. The Bomber supporters would have been thrilled, but also worried when they heard on Monday that their captain coach was in hospital with a poisoned right ankle and was unable to leave his bed. The ankle had been injured 2 weeks earlier in the first match against Collingwood and had been aggravated in the replay. No mention of Reynolds receiving penicillin for his infected ankle, but he had been treated with the new wonder drug earlier in the season for an infected eye. A miracle medicine manufactured for the war was now becoming available for civilians and changing lives, with many cases far more serious than an injured footballer. Collingwood were facing their own injury troubles, with Fothergill out since round 17. Toomey was gone with a hamstring. He had torn his hamstring in the first semi-final after he was persuaded to come back from his injured thigh sooner than he wanted. He had hurt his hamstring snap in the first 20 minutes of that game, and his season was done. Melbourne were favoured to win the preliminary final. They had been in great form, and they were well rested after 2 weeks off. The Magpies were having to cope with those injuries to some of their best players, and 2 tough games in a row. The preliminary final was held on Saturday, September 28, with 59,000 at the game. Despite all the predictions of Melbourne's triumph, it was Collingwood up by 23 points at quarter-time, 20 points at half-time, and 23 points at three-quarter time. Neil Mann had come off the bench at half-time to replace Jack Green, who had done his ankle, and the second-year player was dominating. He kicked 4 goals in the third quarter and another early in the fourth. Halfway through the last quarter, the Magpies seemed to have the game in control. Until they didn't. Melbourne's champion forward, Jack Mueller, did what champions do and dominated the game when it mattered. He kicked 4 goals in the last quarter, and the Demons kicked 7, running over the tired Magpies and winning the game by 13 points. The score looked close, but from halfway in the last quarter, it seemed only Melbourne was going to win the game. They would be back in a grand final, their first since 1941. Collingwood's season had finished like their 1945 season, being overrun in the last quarter of a preliminary final. They had recovered from their dismal performance in the war years, but they were not yet back to grand final performance. Was the training regime of veteran coach Jock McHale suited to the rigours of the post-war game? For the grand final in 1946, Essendon's captain coach was, once again, their King Richard, Dick Reynolds. He was an instinctive footballer. He could weave and sway through a pack and then kick the goal, without really being able to explain how he did it. He led both by example and by generating confidence, by showing that he had faith in his players. He believed in them, so they believed in themselves, and the cycle went round. Early in his football journey, he had tried out for Carlton, the team he supported as a boy. But they knocked him back, a mistake they would regret, and Essendon grabbed him. He won the first of 3 Brownlows in just his second season. He had been playing coach since 1939 and had already led the team to 3 grand finals, winning one against Richmond in 1942, but being defeated by Melbourne in 41 and Richmond in 43. He had been working in aircraft manufacturing at Fisherman's Bend in the later years of the war, which restricted the time he had to focus on his coaching. The return to peace solved that problem and helped get the Dons back to the top of the table. Melbourne's captain was Norm Smith, called the Red Fox. He was a champion of the club. He had joined in 1935 as then coach Checker Hughes was rebuilding the team into a competitive unit. He played at full forward and was as happy to pass to a player in a better position as to kick goals himself. He played in the Demons' hat-trick of premierships between 1939 to 41 and was appointed captain in 1945 when Percy Beames retired as captain-coach. Under the return of coach Frank Hughes, the Demons moved up the ladder in 1945. Having lost many players to wartime service, they had dropped away after their premiership wins, but now they were back in another grand final, and Norm Smith knew how to perform on grand final day. As just mentioned, the Demons had persuaded the man who had turned them from a rabble into a premiership winning machine to take up coaching again in 1945. He had retired after the 1941 premiership with 4 flags as a coach, 3 with the Demons, a name that he had coined, and 1 with Richmond. He was a coach who knew how to treat his players as individuals while getting them all to play for the team. He and the club had dealt with the pain of players killed in the war, Ron Barassi Sr., Louis Truscott, Harold Ball and others. Now he was back, leading a new mix of players into another grand final. The umpire was Thomas Bride, for his one and only grand final. He had started his umpiring career back in 1934 in the Eastern Suburbs Churches competition and made his VFL debut in 1939. He missed the 1944 and 45 seasons due to Army War service, which included umpiring many service games, returning to the VFL in 1946. Prior to this season, he had only umpired 1 final in 1941, but he umpired the second semi and the replay and the preliminary finals, and he had the confidence of the umpires panel to take the biggest game of the season. Outside of football, he sold insurance and enjoyed tennis and swimming. He would only have 1 more season as a field umpire before moving to goal umpire duties, and in 1951 had the rare honour of being appointed as a goal umpire to add to his 1946 field umpire experience. Opinions of 25 leading league players and officials was divided when surveyed by the Herald's Alf Brown in the lead-up to the game. It was basically a 50-50 split, with most predicting a close game. North Melbourne's coach Bob McCaskill made the point that if Reynolds was not absolutely fit, Essendon would be in trouble. The Age and the Herald both leaned to Melbourne, while Jack Dyer, writing in the Sun, was confident Essendon could win. Essendon made 2 changes to their side. Russell Hill had been in and out of the team during 1946, only playing 6 games, and would not have been too surprised to see Herbie Tonks, who had been injured after the drawn semi-final, come back into the team on the half-back flank. Harry Quid, who had been on the bench in the replay semi-final, came into the 18, and Jack Jones went back onto the bench. Melbourne made no changes to their side. They were ready to take on Essendon. Reserve seats for the grand final sold out on Tuesday morning. The 70 people left in the queue and the 500 that turned up later in the day would have to line up for their seats on Saturday, taking their chances or getting in early. 74,000 people were at the grand final, not quite the 80,000 at the 1941 grand final at the MCG, but many more than Princes Park or the Junction Oval in those 3 seasons. The biggest game was away from the MCG. The drawn semi-final meant that the game was being played on the same day as the VFA Grand Final at the Junction Oval. That game between Camberwell and Sandringham, 2 of the association's class of 1925, when 3 teams replaced those who left for the VFL, attracted 30,000 people, 110,000 Melburnians enjoying a festival of football. Sandringham won a thrilling game, in case you're wondering. Those at the MCG who got in early for a good seat got to see the League Sub-District Grand Final, where Richmond United had a 3-point win over Brunswick. Some people, especially those in the members, took advantage of seat warmers, young children who would hold a spot in a prime location, which generated many heated arguments. There was also attention about the use of parcels and rugs to hold a place for latecomers. Not everyone agreed that this was a legitimate practice. The Herald showed a photo of Melbourne supporters with a banner for the Demons draped over the fence. That would become a common practice into the 1970s, until advertising hoardings replaced team encouragement. Melbourne ran out onto the ground before the Bombers, both teams running through a mesh of streamers tied to the race before they had their photos taken. Reynolds won the toss, kicking with the wind to the punt road end. After the national anthem, both teams moved into position. The first surprise of the day was to see Melbourne's Fred Fanning line up in the ruck rather than his normal forward position. Perhaps his efforts in the last quarter of the first semi had inspired Checker Hughes to pull the switch, in the hope of catching the Dons off guard. Jim Mitchell took Fanning's spot at centre-half forward, while Essendon's Perce Bushby had the job of holding the dangerous Jack Mueller. Umpire Bride bounced the ball as the crowd roared their teams on, and before anyone could get settled in their seats, the Demons had raced the ball down to their forward line, with Adrian Dullard kicking the first goal. The game had only been going for 6 seconds, and Melbourne were already 6 points up. They kept up a frantic pace, with the Bombers caught behind, their players out of position, and just not up to the lightning start of the Demons, who soon had 4 goals against the wind, while Essendon remained scoreless. Fanning was dominating in the ruck, starting every move for the on-fire Demons. It took until the 10-minute mark for Essendon to register their first major. A goal to Bill Brittingham, which took his season tally to 63, level with Collingwood's Des Fothergill, who had not played since round 17. That goal helped settle the Dons, who followed up with another to Gordon Lane, putting the quarter back to a more even competition between the two teams. It was a fast-flowing game, with both teams focused on attack rather than defence. Reynolds was roving to perfection, not showing any signs of that ankle injury, while Melbourne seemed to have the edge in the air, with their tall men marking more clearly. When the bell rang for quarter time, the scoreboard told an exceptional tale. Melbourne 8 goals 3, 51, to Essendon 7 goals 2, 44. The accurate kicking and high scoring resulted in a record number of goals for a grand final first quarter, and was a bigger score than many completed grand finals. While the players grabbed an orange and rested for a moment, the supporters tried to digest the frenzied play they had seen so far. Could it keep going for another 3 quarters? The physical elements of the game lifted in the second quarter. The Sporting Globe noted that every kick was met with a good, solid bump. It was no game for the faint-hearted. Did Wally Buttsworth go over the line when he took out Jack Mueller with an extremely solid hip and shoulder? Or was he just shepherding for his teammate Jack Casson? The cheers and hoots from the crowd were divided in their opinion, depending on which team you supported. Essendon scored the first 2 goals before a scramble in the Demons' forward line resulted in a free kick to Jack Mueller, who levelled the score with another goal. The frantic pace of the game had slowed as the physicality increased. There had been hard football, but nothing unfair. The half-time break saw Melbourne just 3 points up, 10 goals 4, 64, to Essendon, 9 goals 7, 61. For supporters, half-time meant a chance for some refreshments and to discuss the game with their friends, while the players were seen by trainers. Some got massages, and then the coaches gave their message to the team. It's not clear what Reynolds said to his players, or whether he spoke to them as individuals, as is often his way, or as a group to reinforce some key points. Whatever was done in the Essendon rooms at half-time, nobody would have expected the third quarter to unfold the way it did. The Bombers were just unstoppable in the third. They put on 3 quick points without the ball leaving their forward line, and scores were level. Another behind to Harry Quid got them in front. They were playing all over Melbourne, but inaccurate kicking meant that the Demons were still in the game. But that was about to change. Reynolds passed to Bill Brittingham, who kicked straight for the first goal of the quarter and his 64th of the season, to take him to the lead of the goal-kicking tally. The leading goal kickers were recognised for their home and away and finals totals in this era, rather than the Coleman Medal, now going to the leading goal kicker in the home and away season. That goal opened the floodgates, and while Melbourne did score 1 goal and went forward on occasion, they spent most of the quarter as spectators, watching an exhibition of skilled, precision football that had never been seen in a single quarter of a grand final. Essendon owned the quarter with accurate passing, coordinated running, a relentless onslaught that took the game away. They had started the third quarter 3 points behind and ended 64 points in front. They kicked 11 goals 8 to 1 goal 1 in what was the most compelling Premiership Quarter that anyone at the MCG had ever seen. The 1946 Premiership had been decided, but there was one final quarter to play. Norm Smith left the ground with an injured leg, and Len Dockett, who had been suffering from gastro earlier in the week and was clearly not well, also put on the dressing gown, allowing Frank Kennedy and Arnold Byfield to come off to the bench for the Demons. It meant that they got to play on grand final day, but perhaps they might have wanted to get back to the rooms early. Essendon gave their bench warmers a chance to go onto the ground at about the 20-minute mark, with Jack Jones and Chris Lambert both getting a run. There were a couple of scuffles as frustration got the better of some players, and both teams kicked a couple of goals, but really, it was just a matter of playing out time. The final scores were Essendon with a grand final record 22 goals 18, 150 to Melbourne, 13 goals 9, 87. Players from both teams swapped jumpers, and the Essendon players carried Reynolds from the ground. Gordon Lane, with 7 goals, was considered by many to be the best on ground, but both Reynolds and Bill Hutchinson were also recognised in a team performance where every Essendon player had excelled. After the game, Melbourne's captain Norm Smith said, "I would like to congratulate the Essendon players, who were much too good on the day. After the first quarter, when we led against the breeze, I thought we had a good chance. Then Essendon swung into stride and went away to a comfortable win." Smith then added, "I would also like to pay tribute to Bride for his umpiring in the final series." Melbourne's coach, Checker Hughes, admitted that he did not regard the Melbourne 1946 side as a really good side, but he added, with a grin, "We might have bluffed our way through against a team with less balance than Essendon." Dick Reynolds was later asked what he thought of the game and that stunning third quarter. He said, "It was unbelievable. I felt like I was a traffic cop, just guiding them on down our way. We just got the ball anyhow. I don't think we had any opponents at all that day." At the Essendon annual general meeting in the following year, he declared 1946 as his greatest year and the 1946 team as the greatest ever. As Dan Eddy notes in his book on Reynolds, King Richard, well worth reading if you get your hands on it, it could be argued that Reynolds was now the finest leader in the game. Having completed his 7th season as sole playing coach at Essendon, he had led the team into finals on 6 occasions. From that platform, they had played in 4 grand finals and 2 losing preliminary finals, culminating in Reynolds now being a dual premiership player, including his first on the MCG. Essendon would go on to play an exhibition game in Casterton the following weekend, defeating a district team strengthened by 5 players from league clubs. However, after the grand final, Essendon officials were planning on playing the game in Melbourne jumpers, given all the players had swapped tops, and supplies were still limited with post-war rationing in place. Essendon won that game, but there was no mention on what jumpers they were wearing. Did they take the field in Melbourne colours? It had been a very successful 50th Jubilee for the VFL. Record crowds, new teams in the finals, a bumper final series with the bonus of a drawn semi-final to add to the revenue. The Player Provident Fund was established, and there had been no defections by major stars to the dread VFA. When the end of the season distribution was calculated, each club would receive £1,000, an 18% improvement on the previous season. The clubs were sure to find a way to spend it. The Footscray were taking the next step to professional club management by appointing a full-time secretary. Just one full-time paid employee to run a club, a little different to the corporate structure that AFL clubs have in the modern era. So we'll leave 1946 there. Essendon were the dominant team. They had recruited well, and they had the balance of youth and experience that positioned them well for seasons to come. Join me in the next episode to see who will challenge Essendon in 1947. If you've enjoyed Grand Final History, please leave a review wherever you get your podcast from, and remember to click follow. The more goals we kick, the easier it is for others to find the podcast. If you have questions or want to leave feedback, please email me at info@grandfinalhistory.au or check out the grandfinalhistory.au website or Facebook or Twitter or Blue Sky for more Grand Final History.